I should probably warn you before we step inside, this story doesn't smell of roses. In fact, it smells faintly of sweat, dust, spilt wine, and the kind of nervous perfume someone might throw on when they know their fate is about to be decided by a man sitting on a throne with too much eyeliner. Yes, you're in a royal court, the kind where the king has just won a battle and the losers are being dragged in. You can almost hear the scraping of sandals against stone floors and the trembling breath of women who know their lives have just been split in half, before the war and after. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Let the night hum around you. Close your eyes and fall backward into a time when kings wrote their revenge not just in blood, but in the fate of the women left behind. The first thing you notice is the silence. Not the comforting kind of silence you get when you turn off your phone and sink into your couch. No. This is the strained silence of dozens of people holding their tongues, because they know one wrong word could send them from guest to prisoner, from wife to widow. And at the center of it, on that raised platform dripping in silk, sits the king, victorious, smug, possibly a little drunk, and absolutely aware that every pair of eyes in this room belongs to someone who either loves him, fears him, or desperately pretends to. Now, here's the thing nobody tells you in textbooks: conquering a city wasn't just about gold, or slaves, or land. It was about humiliation. And nothing humiliated an enemy more than taking his wife. Imagine a warlord standing there, bloodied from battle, and then watching as the woman, who once whispered strategy to him in bed, is handed a goblet of wine and forced to toast the man who killed her husband. That was the real currency of conquest, not just land but legacy, and women were at the heart of it. You might be tempted to picture these queens and noblewomen as delicate, trembling things. Some were. But others had the steely calm of someone who knows how to turn survival into an art. Picture Cleopatra sailing up the Nile in a barge shimmering with gold, casually presenting herself to Caesar not as a defeated widow, but as a living prize. That wasn't just seduction. It was survival strategy. Because once the king had you, he could do one of three things: parade you, possess you, or erase you. And let's be honest, erase rarely came with an easy death. Of course, in modern times we'd call this all a violation of human rights. Back then, it was Tuesday. Now, before you wrinkle your nose too much, think about the awkward family dinners you've sat through. You know, when someone makes a political comment at Thanksgiving and the whole table goes silent. Multiply that by 10,000, add swords, and replace the turkey with an entire dynasty's future. That's what these royal courts felt like. You're standing here, invisible, but very much in the room. And you can feel the tension hanging like incense smoke in the air. Some kings were almost theatrical about it. Take the Assyrians, masters of psychological warfare. They didn't just capture enemy wives. They paraded them through streets, veils torn, jewelry stripped, so everyone could see power transferred from one man's bed to another's throne. It was propaganda in perfume and silk. The message was simple. Not only did I beat your army, I now own your bloodline. Brutal, yes, but effective. Armies thought twice when they realized losing meant their families became trophies. But here's the hidden layer: not all kings wanted wives for lust. Sometimes it was politics. A conquered queen might become a secondary wife, or a concubine, or a hostage raised in silks, but trapped behind palace walls. Imagine knowing that every time you smiled in public, you weren't showing joy. You were showing surrender. And the king's advisors would whisper, "Look how loyal she is now," as though loyalty could be sewn into a gown. And if you think your dating life is complicated, try navigating romance when your choices are: marry the man who slaughtered your husband, or refuse and meet the executioner. It makes ghosting someone's text messages look positively polite, doesn't it? The truth is, women in these scenarios became both weapon and shield. They could be forced into marriage to seal alliances. They could be paraded as proof of divine right. Or they could be quietly erased. Their names scraped from tablets, their portraits painted over, as though their very existence was an inconvenience. The cruelty wasn't always loud, it was sometimes chillingly silent. And you, standing here in the shadows of this hall, can almost hear the shuffle of embroidered slippers as another captive wife is led forward. Her face is blank, but her knuckles are white against the goblet she carries. She knows her husband is gone. She knows her children may be claimed by another household. She knows that her body, once a private space, is now a battlefield. The crowd watches. The king smiles. And you, lucky you, get to see it without having to live it. Though I should warn you, things only get worse once we step outside these gilded halls and into the streets, where the wives of lesser enemies are waiting in chains. You step back from the throne room, following the ripple of whispers as the guards drag in another set of prisoners. These aren't queens in jeweled gowns. These are the wives of generals, advisors, and merchants who had the misfortune of being married to the wrong side of history. Their faces are streaked with dust, their hair tangled, their eyes darting like trapped birds. Some cry quietly, some keep their chins high, but every single one knows the same truth. Their fate is now a spectacle. The smell hits you before the sight does. A sour blend of sweat, horse, and the copper tang of blood still drying from the battlefield. It sticks in your throat. You cough, but no one notices. Too many eyes are fixed on the king. He leans back on his cushioned seat, as if this is a casual afternoon's entertainment. And in a way it is. Because what happens to these women will echo louder than any sword clash on the field. In the ancient world, victory wasn't just about winning. It was about rewriting memory. And the wives of defeated men. They were the footnotes no one asked for, but everyone remembered. Some were given to soldiers as rewards, parceled out like wine skins. Others were dragged through parades, chained to chariots, made into human punctuation marks on the sentence of conquest. Take the fall of Troy, for example. You might think of Helen, the face that launched 1,000 ships. But the real tragedy wasn't just Helen. It was the Trojan women left behind. Andromache, widow of Hector, wasn't just widowed, she was taken as a slave. Her infant son was hurled from the walls, so he wouldn't grow up to avenge his father. The message was sharp. Not only do we defeat you, we wipe out your future too. That's the level of family planning kings had in mind back then. No scented candles, no awkward doctor visits, just a wall, a baby, and a very final drop. It makes the drama of modern divorce court look like a picnic in comparison. At least in those cases, you usually leave with the houseplants. But not all kings handled this the same way. Some, like Alexander the Great, turned captured noblewomen into pawns on his political chessboard. He famously spared the family of Darius Hathor of Persia, his mother, wife, and daughters, after defeating him. Sounds merciful, right? Don't be fooled. He wasn't sparing them out of kindness, he was sparing them as bargaining chips. Imagine being told, "Don't worry, I won't kill you. I'll just keep you as a living ransom while I rewrite your family tree." Comforting, isn't it? And yet Alexander treated Darius' family with such courtesy that stories spread of their astonishment. His soldiers grumbled that their king hadn't enjoyed the spoils of war. But Alexander knew better. Sometimes keeping the enemy's wife alive and untouched was more humiliating than possession. She lived, but she lived as a reminder of her husband's defeat. Her loyalty now forced into service for another man's reputation. Now, you might be wondering, what about the women themselves? Did they have any agency in this nightmare? Sometimes, yes. Some used wit, charm, or sheer stubbornness to carve out survival. Others played the long game, securing their children's futures by aligning with their conquerors. Picture being at a party where you have to smile at the guy who just burned down your house and killed your spouse, while secretly plotting how your son will one day take back the throne. That's not just multitasking. That's historical resilience at its finest. And here's the strange irony: in some cases, conquered wives became more powerful than they ever were before. Take Roxana of Bactria. She married Alexander after he took her homeland. Technically, she was the prize of a conqueror. But in time, she became queen. And after Alexander's death, she schemed and fought for her son's right to the throne. From captive to queen mother, that's one hell of a career pivot. LinkedIn would be impressed. But let's not sugarcoat things. For every Roxana, there were thousands of nameless women whose stories ended in silence. For them, life meant endless servitude. Their bodies commodities, their names erased. Walk down the dusty side streets outside the palace, and you'll see them. Lined up for markets. Auctioned off like cattle. Their beauty appraised. Their fertility measured. Their worth calculated not by character, but by how many children they might bear. The cries of their children, the clatter of coins, the barking of orders. It all blends into a soundscape of despair. And yet, the strangest thing is how normalized it all was. For the victors, this wasn't monstrous. This was tradition. The logic went, if my enemy had won, he would have done the same to me. So I must do it first, harder, louder. It was a game where cruelty wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Kind of like modern office politics, really. You know that guy who takes your idea in a meeting and presents it as his own. Now imagine, instead of a passive-aggressive email, he burns down your city and takes your spouse. Same energy, just with more swords. And as you stand there in this court, watching another woman bow before her conqueror, you realize the cruel brilliance of it. By breaking the wives, the kings broke the memory of the men they defeated. Because what good is a warrior's legacy if his children grow up calling another man father? The crowd claps politely. The king raises his goblet. And you can't help but wonder, what happens when the wine runs out, when the torches are dimmed, when the wives are led away into the night? That, my friend, is where the real story begins. The room empties slowly, but the silence it leaves behind is sticky, like smoke clinging to your clothes. The women vanish into the inner chambers of the palace, swallowed by thick curtains, never to be seen by the public again. For them, the story becomes quieter, but far darker. And you, invisible traveler that you are, decide to follow. What you find behind those velvet curtains isn't the luxury of royal quarters, as much as it is a gilded cage. The wives of enemies often lived in rooms dripping with silk, yes, but every cushion was a reminder of their defeat. Guards stood by the door not to protect them, but to make sure they never walked out. Their jewelry was heavy, but not half as heavy as the silence pressing in from the stone walls. Take the Romans. Oh, they adored spectacle. Captured wives weren't hidden away. They were paraded in triumphs. Picture yourself walking behind a chariot as the crowd cheers for your conqueror. You're forced to smile through cracked lips while the man who destroyed your home tosses coins to the mob. The Romans called it dignitas, but it wasn't dignity. It was degradation. And after the parade, you might end up strangled in a cell, sacrificed to the gods as the final punctuation mark of the celebration. Softer party. Huh. Compare that to the Mongols, who made Roman cruelty look like amateur theatre. For Genghis Khan and his descendants, taking enemy wives wasn't just spoil, it was strategy. They absorbed women into their empire like rivers feeding the sea, using marriages to stitch together alliances. A nobleman's widow might find herself suddenly sharing a bed with a conqueror who saw her womb as real estate for future heirs. And if she refused, well, let's just say Genghis wasn't famous for his patience. It's a little like being merged into a corporate takeover. One day you're proudly running your own office. The next day your desk has been wheeled into someone else's corner, and your job description has been reduced to make them look good. Except, of course, in this case, the job involved heirs and dynasties. The Crusaders were no less inventive in cruelty. When Jerusalem fell in 1099, chroniclers describe rivers of blood and streets slick with carnage. The surviving women, wives, daughters, sisters, were dragged away. Some were taken as prizes, others sold into slavery in bustling markets where buyers lifted veils and poked arms like inspecting livestock. Imagine the sting of humiliation. One day a noblewoman of the holy city, the next a commodity measured by weight and womb. And all of it written down in careful Latin, as though the quill itself could scrub away the horror. And then there were the Ottomans. Their harems are so wrapped in mystery and myth that people forget what they really were: political prisons lined with velvet. Captured women were taught to dance, sing, flatter, and, most importantly, obey. Some clawed their way up, whispering secrets into the ears of sultans, becoming mothers of future rulers. Others faded into the background, their names forgotten, their voices silenced by layers of silk. A harem wasn't paradise. It was a chessboard where every piece had skin breath and a heartbeat. If you're thinking, well, At least some became powerful. Remember this, their power always came at a cost. Every smile had to be calculated, every glance measured. One wrong word, one rival outmaneuvered, and your life could end with a silk cord around your throat. Imagine living your entire life as though you're trapped in a reality show where the prize is survival, and the elimination round involves actual elimination. Now, step back into the shadows of this imagined court with me. The king leans forward, eyes scanning the women before him. You can feel the weight of that gaze. It isn't lust so much as ownership. Like a man appraising livestock, like a collector deciding where to place the newest trinket in his cabinet. And yet, you notice one of the wives doesn't lower her eyes. She stares right back. Not in defiance, too dangerous, but with something colder. Calculation. She's already planning how to turn this loss into leverage. History tells us many such women existed, even if their names have been erased. They played the long game, raising children who would one day avenge their fathers or seize the throne. And here's the kicker, kings knew this. They weren't stupid. That's why some chose to erase wives entirely, to execute them, bury them, or lock them away forever. Because every wife was a risk, a memory of the old dynasty, a seed of rebellion waiting to sprout. To keep them alive was to gamble. To kill them was to send a message. Either way, the woman's body was transformed into a political tool. Think of how we gossip about celebrity relationships today. Who's dating who cheated, who divorced. Now raise the stakes. Imagine every headline not just as scandal, but as international policy. Your breakup doesn't just ruin brunch, it topples empires. That's the scale these royal women lived with. By now, you've probably realized the battlefield never truly ended at the city gates. It seeped into the chambers, the beds, the cradles. Wars didn't stop when the swords were sheathed. They lived on in the bodies of women who had no choice but to carry their conqueror's legacy. Some bore it in silence. Some turned it into strategy. Some disappeared so completely that even history itself shrugged and moved on. You look once more at the king. He raises his goblet, his lips curling into a smile that's half victory, half performance. Around him, the court erupts in applause, and the wives stand there silent, swallowing their futures with bowed heads. You can almost taste the bitterness in the air. And just as the scene fades, a thought grips you. If this is what kings did to the wives of their enemies in gilded courts, imagine what happened in the chaos of the battlefield itself, where there were no rules, no witnesses, and no silks to disguise the violence. The palace walls close behind you with a sigh of iron and stone, and suddenly you're outside, where the true weight of conquest always falls hardest. Forget the silks and goblets. Here in the streets, conquest doesn't smell of incense. It smells of ash, of urine, of sweat from bodies pressed too tightly together in fear. You take a step forward, and your sandals crunch on broken pottery and bones that nobody has bothered to clear away. This is what the victors leave behind, long after the trumpets fade. The wives of kings and generals at least had an audience, a stage on which to play their humiliations. But here, in the narrow lanes of the city, the women who belonged to merchants, artisans, farmers, and soldiers were reduced to spoils. They are huddled together now, their faces drawn tight with sleeplessness, their hands gripping children whose cries rise thinly into the smoky air. Some are already marked with chalk or rope, claimed like livestock for whoever won them. The conquerors swagger through the ruins, their armor clinking, their laughter coarse. They look at these women the way a butcher looks at a carcass, weighing, assessing. For many, this was the unspoken promise of battle, not just land, not just coin, but bodies. The ancient law of war, unwritten, but understood by everyone, was that the defeated owed everything, including their women. It's easy to imagine this kind of cruelty happening only in barbaric times. But let's be honest, the practice lingered for centuries. Greeks, Persians, Romans, Vikings, Mongols, Crusaders, they all carried the same logic. If you lost, your wife was no longer your wife. She was theirs. And if you didn't have a wife, well, congratulations, the conquerors would simply take your sister or daughter instead. Very democratic, in a twisted sense. As you walk through the crowd of captives, you hear the low mutters of bargaining. Coins clink, hands gesture, deals are struck. The women glance sideways, some praying under their breath, others forcing themselves into stillness, trying not to attract attention. You want to look away, but you can't. Because here, stripped of ceremony, you see the raw transaction, human beings turned into trophies before your eyes. And the conquerors didn't just take women, they branded them with new identities. Names were replaced, languages forbidden, religions stamped out. A woman who once prayed to her household gods now knelt before her captor's idol, her children baptized or circumcised into the faith of the enemy. It wasn't just a physical violation, it was an erasure, like deleting a file on a computer and replacing it with something new. Except you can't recover this data from the trash bin. Now, if you're feeling queasy, let me remind you, history was written by the people who did the taking, not the people who were taken. Which means the voices of these women mostly survive in whispers, in poetry, in laments, in fragments of letters. Sometimes they don't survive at all. Their silence is its own testimony. And here's the bitter irony. For the conquerors, this wasn't considered crime, it was custom. The Roman historian Tacitus once wrote about soldiers who expected their general to let them enjoy the spoils. That phrase wasn't about wine or gold, it was about women. Imagine HR policies written like that. Company perk. After a successful quarterly campaign, employees are entitled to enjoy spoils. We'd have lawsuits out the door. But in the ancient world, that was Tuesday. You stop at the edge of the marketplace. A line of captives stands on a wooden platform, their eyes scanning the crowd like hunted animals. Bidding begins. An old man strokes his beard, pointing at one. A young soldier tosses coins at the feet of another. It feels grotesquely familiar, like a livestock auction, like bargain shopping, like dating apps with stakes so high they could choke you. Swipe left, swipe right, except this time your entire future hinges on the gesture. And yet, here's the strange part, some women adapted. Some learned to play the roles forced upon them, waiting for opportunities. A witty remark, a well-timed smile, a carefully plotted escape. There are stories of captives who rose to prominence in their captors' courts, their survival instinct sharpening into influence. Were they traitors? Survivors? Both. History rarely allows us the courtesy of simple answers. One woman in particular haunts you as you watch the crowd, a young widow who stands very still, her child clutching her skirts. The auctioneer slaps her shoulder, trying to make her spin for the buyers, but she doesn't flinch. She holds her gaze steady, as if daring them to see her as more than a body. For a flicker of a moment, you almost believe she might win this silent contest. And then the coins fall, the rope is tied, and she is led away. Her fate becomes another closed door, another story swallowed by time. The sounds of the city press in, fires crackling, merchants shouting, boots stomping through puddles of blood and wine. And through it all, you feel the weight of a realization: kings could humiliate enemy queens with ceremony. But the true cruelty of conquest was here, in the alleys and marketplaces, where nameless women disappeared into new lives they never chose. If you think your worst moving day was stressful, imagine being relocated into a foreign household by force, your entire identity stripped away, your children renamed, your past erased. Suddenly, the nightmare of losing your luggage on a flight feels oddly comforting. And yet, the deeper you wander into this broken city, the more you realize conquest wasn't just cruelty. It was also about control. Kings and their men knew that by taking women, they weren't just punishing the defeated. They were planting themselves in the very bloodline of their enemies. Every child born afterward became a reminder that the old dynasty was gone, replaced by the conqueror's seed. It was genealogy as propaganda, legacy written into flesh. You look at the captives again, and you feel the shiver crawl down your spine. Because here, in the ashes of the city, you can almost hear the echo of generations who would carry this night in their bones. And if you think the marketplace was brutal, wait until you see what happened on the march, when women were dragged along with armies, stumbling through mud and snow, serving not just as captives but as burdens, spoils, and sometimes shields against enemy arrows. The march begins at dawn, though dawn is hardly distinguishable from the night that preceded it. Smoke still lingers like a dirty veil over the city, and the air bites with a chill that has nothing to do with the season. You step carefully as the soldiers herd their captives into long ragged lines, ropes tying wrists, collars fashioned from scraps of chain. The sound is not a trumpet or drum. It's the sobbing of children, the muffled prayers of women, the gruff curses of men who now walk as prisoners behind their wives. You fall in step with the column, feeling the mud suck at your sandals. The road is alive with noise, the creak of wagon wheels, the clink of weapons, the low murmurs of captors claiming spoils like baggage. One soldier jabs his captive with a spear butt, urging her forward with all the tenderness of someone prodding a mule. Another rides his horse slowly alongside, inspecting the women as if he were still at market, selecting cuts of meat. This march is no procession of victors. It's a grim caravan of conquest. The women stumble, their feet raw against the stones. Some carry babies slung across their shoulders, tiny bodies limp with exhaustion. Others are forced to drag sacks of loot, heavy with stolen metal or grain. It's punishment by proxy. Your husbands failed, so you pay. If the men were slaughtered, their wives carried the proof. If the men surrendered, their wives carried the shame. And, as history so often insisted, shame could be weaponized. The conquerors knew that by parading enemy women through towns and villages, they were not just taking bodies. They were breaking morale. Imagine your high school bully not only stealing your lunch money, but also walking your girlfriend through the cafeteria while everyone watched. Multiply that humiliation by thousands, and you'll understand the strategy. At night, the column halts in makeshift camps. Fires glow red against the dark, and the air thickens with the smells of smoke, sweat, and fear. Soldiers lounge around the flames, boasting about the battles, dividing spoils, deciding whose turn it is to guard, and whose turn it is to indulge in perks. You hear laughter, then silence, then muffled sobs. History doesn't need to spell out what happened in those tents. The silence tells you more than enough. And yet, amid the cruelty, strange bonds sometimes form. A captive might cook for her captor, nurse his wounds, or tend to his children born of another war. Over weeks and months, dependence and routine blurred the edges of violence. Survival demanded compromise, and compromise could look disturbingly like companionship. Not love, never love, but a fragile thread of familiarity in a hostile world. This was the paradox of the march. For some women, every step was agony, a chain pulling them further from everything they knew. For others, every step was a calculation: stay quiet, stay useful, stay alive. A word here, a gesture there. It could mean the difference between being discarded in a ditch or being kept alive for another day. Survival was a skill, honed on the road like iron on a whetstone. But don't mistake this for empowerment. These women weren't finding themselves on some ancient gap year backpacking trip. There was no pray love in a chain gang. This was walk, carry, obey. You either kept pace or you collapsed and were left for the crows. And the march showed no mercy. Soldiers didn't pause for fainting captives. They didn't nurse the sick. They moved like a flood, and whatever couldn't keep up was swept away. You watch one woman stumble, her legs buckling under the weight of a sack strapped across her shoulders. A soldier kicks the bundle off her back and then, almost as an afterthought, kicks her too. She lies in the mud for a heartbeat, eyes closed, lips moving silently. Then she pushes herself up, dripping and trembling, and keeps walking. Because the march is relentless. Because the march is the only future left. And then there are the children. Small feet trying to match the pace of grown men. Wide eyes staring at the horizon, as if hoping to see a familiar landmark that will never appear again. Some are quiet, already too numb to cry. Others scream until their throats are raw. And the soldiers laugh at their noise, calling them little trophies, promising they will grow into slaves or soldiers, depending on which god chooses to be crueler. But what strikes you most is not the noise, not the cruelty, not even the endless miles of suffering. It's the eerie moments of stillness. The way the column pauses at a river crossing, and you hear only the rush of water and the ragged breathing of captives. The way the women's shadows stretch long and thin in the firelight, merging with the soldiers, as if the captor and captive were one distorted shape. The way the stars stare down without blinking, indifferent to whether these women live or die. You realize something uncomfortable here. Conquest was not just about what kings did in their halls, but what ordinary soldiers did on the road. The throne might issue commands, but the mud carried the execution. The march was where the unrecorded crimes happened. the ones that never made it into chronicles because no scribe bothered to write them down. And yet, without these women, kingdoms would not hold. They were the invisible foundation stones. They ground the flour, bore the children, softened the rage of warriors when the rage was done. And in this brutal arithmetic, kings understood one truth to claim the land. You must claim the women. The fires crackle lower, and dawn threatens again on the horizon. The column shifts, groaning and creaking back into motion. You feel the pull of the march in your own legs, the ache of endless distance. You understand now that conquest was not an event, but a process, one step after another, dragging women further from freedom until captivity became their only reality. And if you think the march was cruel, wait until you stand inside the harems and hidden chambers of palaces, where captive wives were reshaped into concubines and playthings. The road breaks bodies, but the palace breaks identities, and that is a different kind of death altogether. The gates of the palace swing open with a groan, and you step inside as though walking into another world. Outside, the air was filled with smoke and mud and misery. In here, it smells of honeyed wine incense, and perfumed oils that cling to your skin like a too friendly stranger. Your eyes take a moment to adjust to the dim glow of oil lamps, their flames trembling in the stillness, casting patterns across mosaic floors, polished, smoother than a mirror. And here they come, the women taken not for sale in markets, not for drudgery on the march, but for the inner chambers of the king himself. Their entrance is silent, a procession of lowered heads and stiffened shoulders, ushered into courtyards where fountains still run, even as the city outside lies in ashes. The message is clear. The king's pleasure exists above the ruin. The harem, though that's the word we use now, was not always a single thing. In Egypt it looked one way, in Persia another, in Rome still another. But across time, the essence remained the same, a collection of women brought together as a testament to a ruler's power, stitched together from conquests, treaties, and accidents of fate. It was not, despite what Hollywood likes to whisper, simply a house of pleasure. It was politics made flesh. To bring an enemy's wife into these walls was not just to enjoy her beauty, but to bend her loyalty, to rewrite her destiny, to display her like a war trophy and a chess piece at the same time. The courtiers gathered to watch these new arrivals with a mixture of curiosity and cruelty. Some smiled with satisfaction, recognizing the wives of men they had slain. Others whispered wagers about which one would last the week, the month, the year. To the women, this silence was more terrifying than the soldiers' jeers on the march. Here, they were not being traded as cattle. Here, they were being assessed for assimilation or annihilation. Imagine the dread. Yesterday you were a queen, a noblewoman, a mother presiding over your household gods. Today, you are an object on display in a room where even the marble walls seem to sneer at you. You stand tall, trying not to let your knees shake, but you know every eye is measuring your worth. And the worth is not yours anymore. It belongs entirely to the man who conquered your world. The process of transformation began immediately. Baths were drawn, perfumed oils massaged into bruised skin, haircut or comb dyed with unfamiliar pigments, clothes stripped away, replaced with silks that shimmered like liquid. Even your name could be washed away, replaced with something easier for foreign tongues to pronounce. It was less pampering than programming. The king did not want you as you were. He wanted you rebuilt into what he required. Of course, the palace attendants did their work briskly, chattering among themselves as though preparing for a feast rather than a funeral of identity. One woman jokes that the oils smell better than the blood outside the gates. Another sighs that at least this batch looks healthier than the last. Their laughter grates against the silence of the captives. It's the laughter of people who have long since stopped being shocked, who no longer distinguish between tragedy and routine. If you think spa days are intimidating now, awkward small talk with strangers rubbing scented goo into your pores, imagine one where the goal isn't relaxation, but indoctrination. You don't leave with cucumber slices on your eyes. You leave renamed, reclothed, repurposed. A makeover sponsored not by Sephora, but by Imperial Conquest. Once polished and painted, the women were led into the audience chamber. The king sat elevated on a dais, surrounded by guards whose hands rested too comfortably on their swords. He looked them over not with desire, but with calculation. Some would be selected as concubines, others as servants. A rare few might be elevated to wives of secondary rank. But all of them were pawns now. Every choice the king made a deliberate play in the politics of dominance. There is a strange quiet here, the kind that buzzes louder than noise. The women's breaths are shallow, their eyes fixed just slightly below the king's gaze. One dares a glance upward and is met with the flat, unreadable look of a man who holds her entire future between his fingers. He doesn't need to shout or gesture. The silence is enough. Sometimes, the humiliation was deliberate and public. A king might force an enemy's wife to serve wine at banquets, making her pour goblets for the same generals who killed her husband. Sometimes he dressed them in slaves' garb and paraded them through courtyards, a living reminder of victory. And sometimes he did the opposite, seating them beside him as though they were trophies in human form, daring anyone to forget whose conquest they embodied. You stand in the back of the hall, and you feel the weight of the eyes pressing down. Not just the king's, but the entire court's. These women are no longer wives, no longer themselves. They are the physical proof of conquest, proof that the enemy's lineage has been disrupted, their family name swallowed. They are symbols, as much as they are people. And if you think that sounds dehumanizing, you're right. But what's worse is how effective it was. Because every time an enemy's wife bore a child in that palace, it rewrote the family tree. It planted the conqueror's blood inside the veins of the defeated. It was legacy theft, one at a time. The fountain bubbles cheerfully nearby, as though mocking the silence of the chamber. And you can't help but notice. The palace smells sweet, the floors shine, the silks shimmer. But under it all, you still catch the faint, metallic tang of iron and fear. And if you think this audience hall is chilling, wait until you follow the women deeper. Into the private chambers where politics ended and personal nights began, where even the perfume couldn't hide the weight of dread. The chamber doors close behind you with a heavy thud, muffling the sounds of fountains and courtiers' laughter. The air inside is warm, almost suffocating, heavy with burning myrrh and the faint sweetness of crushed rose petals scattered on the floor. At first glance, the room is luxurious. Silken cushions, gold, threaded tapestries, carved cedar screens filtering lamplight into patterns across the walls. But beneath the soft glow, the atmosphere vibrates with tension. These walls don't echo with music or poetry, they hum with the silence of women waiting to see if they will survive the night. The king enters, not in armor but in robes dyed deeper than blood, a jeweled belt slung casually around his waist. He does not look at the women immediately. He never has to. They are already standing in practiced postures, heads bowed, hands folded, like statues waiting to be animated by his attention. And yet, each one's mind is racing. Some pray. Some rehearse words of flattery in the conqueror's tongue. Others simply try to slow their breathing, because panic can betray more than words ever will. Imagine, if you will, being chosen for a date where rejection is not an option, where your safety depends entirely on whether the other person finds your presence amusing or useful. No awkward goodnight handshake, no polite excuse to leave. Just the knowledge that your fate could pivot on a glance, a word, or the king's whim as he sips his wine. Suddenly, your worst Tinder horror story seems like a fairy tale. The attendants lead one woman forward, a former queen, once resplendent in her own palace, now dressed in silks chosen not for her comfort, but for the king's pleasure. She steps carefully across the mosaics, each footfall a negotiation between dignity and submission. Behind her eyes burns a storm she dares not show. To falter might be defiance, to smile too quickly might be mockery. Survival lies in the razor-thin space between. The king lifts his goblet and gestures lazily for her to pour. She kneels, filling the cup with trembling hands. A drop spills on his fingers, and the chamber freezes. For the briefest moment, time itself holds its breath. Will this be the mistake that costs her life? But the king only licks the drop away, smirking, as if amused by her terror. The court scribes won't record that smirk. But here, in the suffocating silence of the chamber, you feel it ripple through every captive present, a reminder that mercy is nothing more than a mood. Some nights ended with ritual humiliation. A conquered wife might be forced to sing the songs of her homeland for her new captor's amusement. each note a reminder that her voice now belonged to them. Others were ordered to dance, to serve, to kneel. And of course, some were taken into the king's bed, not because of desire, but because possession itself was the ultimate declaration of power. But here's the irony: sometimes, those forced into intimacy learn to wield it. Not all, not most, but a cunning few. Whispered secrets, carefully timed favors, the delicate art of making a captor believe he was in control while planting seeds of influence. History gives us hints. Queens who began as captives, concubines who rose to power, mothers of princes who eventually ruled. For every 100 women erased into silence, one carved her name into the very stone of dynasties. Still, don't let those exceptions fool you. For most, the nights were nothing but a series of rehearsed smiles and unspoken fears. A woman might lie awake afterward, staring at ceilings painted with stars, wondering if her children, those she lost or those she might bear, would ever know who she truly was. The silks itched, the perfume stung her nose, the gold cut into her wrists. Luxury is no comfort when it chains you to someone else's legacy. And all the while, the rest of the harem watched. Walls were thin. Eyes were everywhere. Rivalries brewed like bitter tea. Captives competed for scraps of favor, sometimes turning against one another in the desperate hope of survival. A whispered insult, a stolen trinket, a rumor of disloyalty. Small sparks could ignite into punishments too terrible to name. Because here, it wasn't just the king who held power. The women themselves were forced into a cruel hierarchy, where betrayal might buy you one more breath. It's easy, from the comfort of a modern couch, to think you would resist, that you'd fight back, that you'd keep your dignity. But standing here, in these gilded rooms that smell of roses and fear, you understand why so many chose submission. Sometimes survival itself is the only rebellion left. The king reclines against his cushions, sipping his wine, already bored with tonight's display. He gestures for music, and flutes begin to echo softly through the chamber, their notes thin and trembling. The women retreat to the shadows, their faces carefully blank. Tomorrow will bring new rituals, new humiliations, perhaps new opportunities. Tonight, they endure. And as you slip out of the chamber, leaving behind the muffled music and the weighted silence, you can't help but think, if this was the fate of women within the walls of palaces, what of those cast aside, left in the streets, discarded when they no longer amused their captors? The palace fades behind you, its lamps glowing faintly like a cruel mirage in the distance. You step back into the night air, where the scent of roses evaporates, and the harsher smells of the city return: smoke, dung, sweat, and the faint, coppery tang of blood still drying in the streets. Here is where the women who were not deemed worthy of palace silks were sent. Not pampered, not painted, not paraded at banquets. Cast aside into the raw machinery of conquest, they are lined up along the outer courtyards, tethered like unwanted horses. Their eyes dart nervously, not toward kings but toward soldiers, merchants, and opportunists who wander past to inspect the leftovers. That word isn't mine. It's what some chronicles imply, in the coldest shorthand possible. Not every captive could become a concubine. Not every enemy's wife was fit to stand beside a throne. And so, many were pushed into a life that was somehow even crueler: slavery. It was an efficient system. A general might auction off hundreds of women in a single day, their fates written on clay tablets like inventory notes. 10 strong for weaving, 3 young for tending children, 2 for the brothel. The language of property stripped away identity, boiling human lives down to categories and price tags. And here you stand, hearing the murmur of bidding, the snap of whips, the weary shuffle of bare feet across stone. Some were sold as domestic slaves, destined to grind grain until their arms grew rope, hard, to scrub floors until their knuckles cracked, to haul water until their backs bent. Others were sent to textile workshops, their fingers raw from endless hours of spinning, weaving, dyeing. The work was brutal, but survivable. And survivable meant profitable, for their owners, at least. But then there were those sold into darker corners. Brothels flourished in conquered cities, their doorways thick with smoke and laughter. Captive women were fed wine not for pleasure, but to dull resistance, to keep them pliant, to erase the memory of who they once were. Some brothels became so infamous that they were recorded in travel accounts, not as tragedies, but as curiosities. tourists of antiquity in their own way, came to gawk. Now pause a moment and imagine being forced into customer service on its worst possible setting, no breaks. No tips, no option to quit. The complaints come not in Yelp reviews but in lashes of a whip. Suddenly, your nightmare shift at Starbucks seems like a spa retreat. For many women, there was no dignity in these roles. But survival still flickered like a stubborn flame. They carved out small mercies where they could. A lullaby sung softly to another captive's child. A scrap of bread shared in the dark. A whispered joke, quick and dangerous. That could make the chains feel lighter for a moment. The resilience of the discarded often went unrecorded, because history rarely cares about those who endure quietly. But if you listen hard enough, you can almost hear their laughter echo in the cracks between chronicles. And yet, not all discarded wives became invisible. Some were used as examples. The conquerors might mutilate them, shave their heads, brand their skin, and march them through streets as warnings. The message was clear: resist, and this will be your wife's fate. It was terrorism dressed as justice, staged in public squares with crowds pressed close, some weeping, some jeering, all learning their lesson. In other cases, discarded captives were forced to marry into the lower ranks of the conquering army, given not to kings but to foot soldiers, of reward, handed out like rations. Imagine your entire dowry being boiled down to, congratulations, soldier, here's a human being, enjoy. Romance, clearly, was not part of the package. The cruelty, you realize, was not random. It was systematic. Every choice had a purpose: to erase the enemy's pride, to fracture their families, to plant fear so deep it would last for generations. Because what better way to ensure your enemies never rise again than to shatter the women who might carry their line forward? And yet, here comes the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes those discarded women adapted in ways that startled their captors. A slave might become indispensable in her master's household, trusted to manage accounts or raise children. A concubine cast off by a king might charm her way into a governor's favor. A brothel captive might become a whispered figure of renown, infamous in ways that defied her captor's attempts to erase her. Survival took strange forms, bending around cruelty like a tree growing sideways out of stone. But for everyone who bent and survived, hundreds broke. Their names dissolved into the dust. Their children, if they had them, grew up knowing only fragments of where they came from. Their songs and prayers faded into silence. And you realize, walking among them, that this silence is perhaps the loudest sound of all. If you think getting ghosted in the 21st century is bad, imagine being erased from history itself. Not blocked on social media, but blocked from existence. No profile, no posts, no memory. Just gone, swallowed by the machinery of conquest. The torches flicker in the courtyard, their smoke curling upward into the starless sky. The women shift uncomfortably, tugging at ropes, waiting for the next hand to point, the next coin to fall. Some try to look invisible, some try to look appealing, all try to look alive. Because here, even breathing has become a performance. And as you turn from the courtyard, the air heavy with the scent of fear and ash, you know this. Not every captive made it to palaces of gold. Many walked into lives of labor, humiliation, or oblivion. And the cruelest part, for them, there was no audience. No historian took notes. No poet sang their names. They simply dissolved into the dark tide of conquest, forgotten except for the faintest echoes. But if you think being discarded was the end of their suffering, wait until you hear what happened when captives weren't just enslaved or humiliated, but used as weapons in war, turned against their own families, their own people, their own homes. The courtyard empties slowly, coins exchanged, ropes tightened, and the last stragglers dragged away. But not all are sold to merchants or shoved into slave barracks. Some, you notice, are pulled aside by officers and scribes, men who whisper to one another while studying the women with a calculating eye. These are not buyers, they are strategists. Because to them, the women of the defeated are not just bodies to be owned, but weapons waiting to be unsheathed. Consider the twisted brilliance of it. A captive wife, a daughter of a noble enemy, could be sent back into her own city as bait. A soldier might disguise her return as an escape, only for her to carry hidden messages or diseases or rumors, designed to corrode her people from the inside. One woman, moving through her old streets, could do more damage than 1,000 soldiers battering at the walls. And she wouldn't even need to carry a sword. Just words, just whispers, just the sight of her returning changed. The Persians were particularly fond of this. Captives could be paraded near the walls of besieged towns, dressed in rags, beaten, their voices hoarse from shouting pleas for surrender. The soldiers watching would see not just their wives or daughters suffering, but the mirror of what might happen to every family if they resisted. It was psychological warfare before the term existed, and it worked because it tapped into the deepest terror of any soldier, that his home was already lost, even while he still fought. Imagine the horror of it. You're on the ramparts, clutching a spear, your heart pounding, and suddenly you hear your wife's voice echoing up from below, not calling your name in love, but begging you to open the gates so her torment might end. You know, in your mind, it's a trap. But in your chest, the ache is unbearable. How long could you stand there, watching her dragged across the ground, before something inside you snapped? And just like that, a kingdom could fall without a single stone being toppled. Now, let's pause here. In our time, we've perfected the art of passive, aggressive psychological warfare too, though in much smaller doses. Ever get a "seen" notification on your phone but no reply? That's practically the medieval equivalent of watching your wife paraded outside city walls. You know what it means. You know it's killing you. And yet you sit there anyway, waiting for the gates to break. But warfare didn't stop at parading. Some women were forced to marry the enemy, not as concubines hidden away, but as highly public pawns. A defeated king's wife might be remarried off to one of her conqueror's generals, her new role designed to humiliate her former husband even more. Imagine your spouse not just leaving you, but being gifted away like a trophy at a victory party, and then forced to bear children who would one day grow up as proof of your defeat. Each baby, in that sense, became a living monument to conquest. Even worse were the deliberate reintroductions. A woman, once a queen stripped of her silks, scarred by her captors, could be sent back into her old court, not to reign, but to sit in the shadows as a reminder of how fragile power really was. Her very presence said, "This could happen to any of you. Play your politics wrong, and you'll be drinking the same bitter cup." The Romans loved this particular humiliation. They called it triumphus, parading captives, sometimes even royal women, through the streets in chains as part of the victory procession. Crowds would cheer, garlands would fly, and there she was, once a queen, now a symbol of utter defeat. And at the end of the parade, a quiet disappearance. No one asked what happened after, because everyone already knew. And yet, some captives played their roles with unexpected ferocity. There are accounts of women who refused to cry, who laughed at their captors during parades, who spat in the faces of soldiers even while chained. Imagine the crowd's reaction. Expecting to see a broken victim, but instead finding a defiant queen who acted as though they were the pitiful ones. That kind of defiance could shake the mood of an entire city. Of course, defiance had its costs. Those who mocked their captors usually paid with their lives, often publicly. But in that brief moment of courage, they stole back the narrative, if only for a heartbeat. And maybe that was enough. You walk now through a field outside the city, where the remnants of the war still lie scattered. Splintered shields, broken spears, the faint stink of death on the soil. And there in the distance, you see women tending the wounded. Not out of mercy, but because they were forced to keep prisoners alive for ransom. A strange irony. The same women whose families had been destroyed, now tasked with nursing their enemies back to health. History loves its cruel circles. And yet, here's the strangest twist of all. In some conquests, women who were taken as weapons ended up shaping dynasties. They bore children who became heirs, advisors, rulers. A war bride, forced into a union against her will, might one day see her son crowned king. The very ones used to humiliate could, generations later, reshape the conqueror's line. Kings who thought they were extinguishing enemies sometimes ended up planting seeds for futures they never imagined. Life, it seems, always finds its ways to mock power. It's a grim paradox. On the one hand, women were shattered, erased, reduced to pawns. On the other, they were sometimes the thread that carried history forward, even against the will of those who tried to crush them. Survival, reproduction, adaptation. It all became a subtle form of rebellion, one kings rarely recognized until it was too late. And as you leave the field, the night thick around you, you hear faint laughter carried on the wind. Not cruel, not broken, but sharp, like a secret joke passed between survivors. You can't quite catch the words, but you know what it means. Even in the depths of conquest, even when used as weapons, some women found ways to remain human. And that humanity, however faint, was their final defiance. But if you think this was disturbing, wait until you see what happened when kings didn't just use enemy wives as property or weapons, but as currency, trading them like coins to cement alliances, betrayals, and the rise of entire empires. The hall smells of wax and wet wool, a strangely ordinary scent for a place where kingdoms are about to gamble with human lives. Torches spit along the stone walls, dripping hot tears of tallow, while men in cloaks lean over long oak tables littered with maps, scrolls, and cups of wine. But the real negotiations aren't marked in ink or measured in land. They're standing quietly in the corner, veiled and silent, eyes fixed on the floor. Because tonight, the treaty will not be signed with quills. It will be sealed with a woman. Marriage as a political tool is as old as power itself. You'd think kings would be satisfied with armies and fortresses. But no, the ultimate insurance policy was to send your daughter into your enemy's bedchamber. One night of consummation could stitch together two rival dynasties faster than a decade of diplomacy. And if she happened to produce a healthy heir, well, then your bloodline wasn't just tied to your enemies. It was entangled like ivy, impossible to separate without killing the whole vine. Imagine being that daughter. You grew up surrounded by tapestries and tutors, your father's courtiers bowing low, telling you how precious you were. And then one day, over dinner, he casually announces that you're now the key to peace with a kingdom that yesterday was burning your villages. Congratulations. Darling, you're going to save us all. Do smile. Talk about pressure. Modern parents stress about sending their kids to college. Imagine sending yours across a border with 50 guards, a chest of Dori gold, and a strict command to be charming, fertile, and politically useful. Or else, suddenly, college tuition doesn't look so bad. Take Cleopatra, for instance. Not that Cleopatra with the eyeliner and Roman lovers, but Cleopatra of Macedon, sister to Alexander the Great. She was married off to secure alliances, her womb practically a battlefield, where generals hoped to plant their claims. The negotiations over her hand were so intense that wars nearly broke out just over who got to marry her. Forget gold or land. Her body was the prize. And then there were the medieval European princesses, shipped off in caravans like diplomatic Amazon packages. Some of them barely teenagers, sent to marry kings twice or 3 times their age. Picture being 13, trying to navigate puberty and an international peace treaty at the same time. The wedding vows must have sounded less like, for love and honor, and more like, please don't start a war while I'm still learning long division. The strangest part, many of these women knew they were walking into lions' dens. A bride sent into enemy territory often had no allies, no safety net, and no way home. If peace broke down, she was the first bargaining chip to be threatened, imprisoned, or quietly disposed of. A husband might smile at her during the wedding feast, and have her locked in a tower by the following winter. And yet, some played this treacherous game brilliantly, weaving influence with the subtlety of spiders. You can almost see them now, standing in candlelit halls, listening while men talked of armies and taxes, nodding politely while quietly storing away every word. Later, in bedchambers draped with brocade, they would repeat those words in just the right tone, steering their husbands toward decisions that echoed across continents. All while smiling sweetly, as though politics were the last thing on their minds. But for every clever manipulator, there were dozens who were simply crushed. A woman's life could turn from silken gowns to iron bars in a heartbeat, if the alliance soared. Some were killed, others cast aside, their very existence a reminder of treaties that had failed. You weren't just married to a man. You were married to the precarious hopes of 2 kingdoms. And kingdoms, as history proves, are fickle husbands. The irony, kings would rant about loyalty and honor, but when it came to their daughters, loyalty meant handing them over to former enemies like chess pawns. It's one thing to betray a fellow noble. It's another thing entirely to look into your child's eyes and say, "Yes, darling, you're my most precious possession," which is exactly why I'm giving you away. And as you stand here, in this smoke-filled hall watching men haggle over maps, you realize the real map is standing silently in the corner. A girl barely older than the candles dripping their wax. And she knows her body will soon be the border her father has redrawn. But if you think treaties sealed with marriage were strange, wait until you see what happened when women were traded not for peace, but for betrayal. The kind of exchanges where one bride could topple empires, and one bedchamber whisper could redraw the world. The feast is over. The platters of roasted boar are stripped clean, the goblets drained, the musicians long dismissed. Only the echoes remain, echoes of laughter that was never entirely genuine, of toasts raised with hands that gripped daggers just out of sight. And in the center of it all, the new bride sits stiffly on her cushioned chair, her smile frozen as the wax of her wedding candles melts into nothing. She is the treaty, the hostage, the living reminder that peace now has a pulse. But here's the problem with trading wives and daughters like coins: get spent, lost, stolen. And unlike gold, a woman in the wrong place could bring an empire tumbling down. Picture a Byzantine princess, married off to secure peace with a barbarian warlord. At the wedding, everyone claps, the priests chant, and the wine flows. But in the dead of night, she whispers secrets she was never meant to share, details about fortifications, supply routes, rival loyalties. By morning, the warlord doesn't just have a bride, he has the keys to an empire, and she, well, she's no longer her father's daughter. She's a traitor with a crown. And then there are the poisoners. Ah, yes. The quiet art of slipping powders into goblets or cakes, learned from mothers and grandmothers who knew survival sometimes required alchemy. A daughter sent abroad could become her family's silent dagger. What better way to weaken a rival than through a wife who smiles sweetly and serves you wine? Countless rulers died mysteriously young, their queens conveniently foreign. Historians write illness, but behind closed doors, everyone knew it was the dowry that killed them. Of course, not every bride turned poisoner. Some simply disappeared into their new courts, their names swallowed by foreign tongues. Others bore children whose loyalties were torn in half. Imagine growing up with a mother who whispered lullabies in one language, and a father who ordered soldiers into battle against that very homeland. Which side of your blood would you claim? Which half of your identity would you betray? Dynasties cracked open like eggshells under the weight of such contradictions. But let's not pretend the kings were innocent here. Many treated marriage alliances as disposable. One year's princess, bride could be next year's political liability. Henry V of England, for example, didn't just send wives away. He chopped some of their heads off when alliances soared. Imagine being the father of one of those brides, getting the letter that said, "Peace is cancelled, and by the way, your daughter no longer has a neck." That's one way to ruin diplomatic relations. What's remarkable is how some of these women managed to turn their helplessness into leverage. Catherine de' Medici, sent from Italy into the snake pit of French politics, endured years of being sidelined. But when the tide shifted, she rose, not through armies or treaties, but through patience and careful manipulation. She used her position as mother, widow, and regent to keep herself at the center of power for decades. Her father may have sent her as currency, but she returned the investment with interest. Still, for every Catherine, there were countless unnamed daughters whose only mark on history was a signature on a treaty or the memory of a feast. They were the invisible threads holding peace together, threads easily snapped when greed, lust, or betrayal tugged too hard. Here's the dark humor of it all. Kingdoms relied on women to be the glue that held treaties, alliances, and dynasties together. Yet those same kingdoms dismissed women as weak, as secondary, as mere ornaments. They trusted their daughters to do what armies could not, then pretended their success or failure was the work of fate, not flesh. It's a bit like refusing to acknowledge your Wi-Fi router while depending on it for your entire existence. And so you stand again in the candlelit hall, watching as men debate maps while their daughters wait silently nearby. Some of these girls will be queens, others pawns, a few perhaps both at once. But all of them carry a strange kind of power. the power of being currency in a game where kingdoms rise and fall like dice cast on a table. And if you think being traded away as currency was cruel, wait until you see what happened when women were used as entertainment. Paraded, mocked, and forced into spectacles that stripped away not just their freedom, but their very humanity. The torches burn low, but the laughter is loud. You step into the great hall, where the smell of roasted meats hangs heavy, mingled with spilled ale and the sartang of sweat. It's late, long past the hour when dignity should have sent everyone to bed. But kings don't keep ordinary hours, and tonight the king is in the mood for sport. Not jests, not hunting, not games of chance. No, the sport tonight is humiliation. At first you think you're walking into a festival. The crowd roars, cups slam against tables, the musicians scrape their fiddles with frantic energy. But then your eyes adjust, and you see them. Women standing in the center of the hall, dressed in costumes that are not their own. Foreign queens made to wear peasant rags, enemy wives draped in garish silks, their faces painted like masks. The jesters are not jesters at all, but captives forced into the role of clowns. The king leans forward on his throne, grinning, a goblet of wine balanced carelessly in his hand. His courtiers imitate his laughter like echoes, as if their own safety depends on mirroring his mood. The women are commanded to sing, to dance, to recite verses in languages the courtiers do not understand. And when they stumble, because of fear, because of exhaustion, because humiliation tightens the throat like a noose, the laughter doubles, sharp and merciless. It's the cruelest theater you can imagine. Not actors who choose their roles, but women who once sat on thrones themselves, now reduced to marionettes for the conqueror's amusement. You see one woman, her hands trembling as she lifts a lute. Once she played in the golden halls of her homeland, where every note was greeted with reverence. Tonight, her strings snap mid-song, and the hall erupts in jeers. The king throws a bone from his plate at her feet. She bows her head, though her face burns with shame. And you wonder if she is swallowing her rage, storing it like a hidden ember, or if she has already broken inside. Now, before you judge too harshly from your safe, modern seat, consider this: we still revel in humiliation as entertainment. Reality TV thrives on it. Viral videos live on it. People tripping, failing, sobbing. All turned into spectacles for an audience eager to laugh. The only difference is that the contestants today, at least, signed a contract. These women had no such luxury. Sometimes the performances were far worse than singing or dancing. Roman emperors were notorious for forcing captured noblewomen to take part in theatrical plays that ended not with applause, but with death. A queen might be cast as a tragic heroine, only to find the sword in the script was no prop at all. Imagine the horror of being told, "Tonight you play Dido," and realizing the flames on stage are real. The audience roared with delight as history and theater fused into execution. Even outside Rome, humiliation took endless forms. In Japan, defeated wives of samurai could be forced to serve as cupbearers, kneeling endlessly at banquets where the men toasted the death of their families. In medieval Europe, captured noblewomen were sometimes paraded through streets in cages, like exotic animals, while townsfolk pelted them with filth. And in the courts of Mongol Khans, women might be ordered to wrestle, stripped of dignity, while their conquerors bet on the outcome like gamblers at a tavern. The point was never entertainment alone. The point was to remind everyone watching who had power and who did not. Every laugh, every jeer, every forced bow was a performance not just for the king, but for the whole world, a stage where dominance was written on the bodies of women. And yet, look closer. Behind the trembling hands, the bowed heads, the painted smiles, there are sparks. A glance exchanged between captives. A song that shifts subtly into a dirge. Its melody twisted into mourning even as the court applauds. A dance that, while meant to amuse, carries the rhythm of resistance. Small acts of defiance. Hidden in plain sight, like graffiti scratched on palace walls. You can almost hear them whispering to one another in the shadows. They think we are broken. Let them laugh. We still have our secrets. But if you think humiliation as entertainment was the lowest cruelty, wait until you see what came next, when kings stopped treating women as performers and began treating them as experiments, pushing the boundaries of pain and control in ways too grotesque to fit even in the darkest theater. The music stutters to a stop, leaving behind a silence thick as smoke. The king is not finished. His goblet tips, splashing wine across the rushes, and with a lazy wave of his hand, he signals for something darker. The courtiers lean forward, eager, nervous. They've seen this before. They know that when laughter grows stale, fear will be the next dish served. From the far side of the hall, guards drag in two women. Their clothes are torn, their eyes wide, their steps unsteady from days of hunger. The crowd hushes in anticipation, and you feel the pit of your stomach twist. Whatever is about to happen, it isn't theater anymore. It's a demonstration. Sometimes the entertainment wasn't music or dance, but punishment disguised as spectacle. Captive women were forced into mock trials, accused of absurd crimes, treason, sorcery, even conspiring with their own beauty. They stood trembling while courtiers played the roles of judge and jury, their verdict always the same: guilty. The punishment could be as simple as public humiliation, or as horrific as execution staged as a comedy. The Romans perfected this theater of cruelty. In the amphitheater, noblewomen captured from foreign lands were dressed in mythological costumes and forced to act in plays where the death scenes were real. One was made to play Medea, a mother who murdered her children. She screamed as her captors killed the children beside her on stage, the crowd howling with approval. For them it was drama. For her it was apocalypse. Even when death wasn't the finale, kings used pain as pageantry. Some ordered captives branded during feasts, their screams echoing while courtiers pretended not to flinch. Others forced wives of enemies to serve naked at banquets. Their bodies smeared with honey so dogs or insects would crawl across their skin while guests laughed into their cups. It was cruelty dressed up as sport, and the women became unwilling performers in the most grotesque circus imaginable. Now, before you shake your head at the barbarism of it all, ask yourself, have we really changed? Public humiliation hasn't vanished, it's migrated. Instead of amphitheaters, we have stadiums, screens, and online arenas. We may not throw queens to lions anymore, but reputations are still shredded for applause, and tears are still monetized as content. Different tools, same hunger. Humanity hasn't grown out of cruelty, it's just rebranded it. But let's return to that banquet hall, where the king leans forward, eyes gleaming. The captives are forced to dance, stumbling on bare feet across cold stone, their bodies shaking not with rhythm but with terror. The courtiers clap out of sync, drunk and giddy, until one woman collapses. Instead of stopping, the crowd laughs harder, as if fainting were the punchline of the act. And then, because kings were never content with cruelty alone, the performance escalates. A captured queen is brought forth, veiled, trembling, and ordered to choose the punishment of another. Refuse, and she suffers twice as much. Choose, and she lives with the guilt forever. That's the real genius of these grotesque entertainments. The cruelty was not just inflicted, but forced to echo through the victims themselves. The room erupts with cheers as the choice is made. One life traded for another. You watch, horrified, realizing this isn't entertainment at all. It's pedagogy. A lesson to all the king can make you sing, dance, bleed, or betray. He can hollow you out and turn your humanity into the evening's amusement. And yet, sometimes, a sliver of resistance shone through. Chronicles tell of women who laughed in the face of their tormentors, who mocked the king during their forced performances, turning the laughter back on him. Others sang dirges instead of ballads, their voices so haunting that even drunk courtiers shifted uneasily, as if hearing a curse woven into the tune. Defiance, even dressed as despair, had its own strange power. As the banquet dwindles and the torches die, you feel the weight of the hall pressing in. The women shuffle away, some broken, some whispering to one another in voices too soft for the guards to notice. And in those whispers, in that secret survival, there lingers a truth the king could never extinguish. Even when used as toys, they were still witnesses. They would remember, and memory in time could be sharper than any blade. But if you think being turned into entertainment was the final cruelty, wait until you step outside these halls and see what happened when kings weaponized women's very bodies. Not for laughter, not for treaties, but as instruments of terror and destruction against entire populations. You step outside the banquet hall, and the air hits you like a slap. Gone are the perfumes and roasted meats of the feast. Out here, the stench of humanity gathers in alleyways, sweat, blood, and the faint sweet rot of uncollected waste. The king's entertainment may be over for tonight, but the true theatre of power plays out in the streets and in the quiet chambers of conquered homes. Here, there is no stage. There is only survival. History is a cruel archivist. It remembers battles, treaties, and triumphs carved into stone. But it often whispers only faintly about the women left in the wake. And yet, if you listen closely enough, you can hear it. The crackle of doors splintering as soldiers enter, the muffled cries behind shuttered windows, the silence of entire households when dawn arrives and no one dares speak of what happened. For conquerors, women were not just prizes. They were instruments, tools. A way to write dominance across the skin of an enemy and leave scars that spoke louder than any proclamation. Taking a city was one thing. Taking its women, that was how you broke its spirit. Consider the Mongols. Their cavalry thundered across Eurasia like a plague on horseback, and they understood the psychology of terror better than most. To resist them was to invite annihilation. When they stormed cities, women were often distributed as spoils to the soldiers, yes. But more sinister was the spectacle of violation carried out publicly, designed to humiliate entire families and clans. It wasn't about lust. It was about imprinting fear, so deep that surrender seemed the only rational choice for the next city on their path. The Assyrians, long before them, carved into their palace walls scenes of conquests, where women were paraded as living trophies, sometimes tethered like animals, sometimes forced to watch the slaughter of their children before being dragged into captivity. Imagine standing there, a queen once adorned in silk and gold, reduced to trembling in the dust, the symbols of your reign now hanging around someone else's neck. That was the point. Your body was a battlefield, and losing it was meant to erase the memory of your people's independence. The Romans had their own flair for turning women into warnings. When Boudicca rose against them in Britain, her fury was born from what Roman officials did to her daughters. Public violation, meant to remind every tribe in the Isles that resistance would not only bring the sword, but would etch shame across generations. The Romans knew that a dishonored body didn't just wound the woman. It fractured families, broke alliances, and stained entire lineages. Clever, in a monstrous way. They understood that conquest wasn't just a clash of swords but a war of symbols, and women's bodies carried the heaviest ones. Now pause here for a moment. Before we congratulate ourselves on being modern and civilized, remember that the logic hasn't changed much. We still weaponize humiliation. Only now it's often digital rather than physical. Instead of parading captives through the streets, reputations are shredded online, images leaked, secrets exposed, not to satisfy lust, but to assert dominance. The medium shifts, the cruelty remains. Back in antiquity, the weaponization of women's bodies was systematic. After a victory, conquerors often forced noble women into marriages with their captors. On the surface, this could look like diplomacy. Alliances sealed with a wedding feast, two families joining. But peel back the gilded surface, and what you see is violence in ceremonial clothing. These marriages were rarely voluntary. They were ways to legitimize conquest, to erase bloodlines, to turn yesterday's queens into tomorrow's concubines. The Ottomans perfected this. In the aftermath of conquest, daughters and wives of defeated rulers were swept into the harem. There, stripped of political identity, they became both trophies and potential tools. A sultan might father children with them, children who carried both conquered and conquering blood. It was a way of neutralizing enemies, absorbing them into the empire, one at a time. Romantic, efficient, absolutely. The one became a political weapon, whether the women agreed or not. Even biblical texts preserve whispers of this grim reality. When Israelite armies triumphed, captives were divided, and women often became wives of their conquerors. The euphemism cloaked the brutality. Rituals of shaving heads and mourning periods were imposed before consummation. But beneath the ceremony was the same logic: your body is no longer your own. It now belongs to the victory of someone else. But there's another layer, darker still. Sometimes, kings used women, not just as instruments of humiliation for their enemies, but as punishments for their own men. Soldiers who displeased a ruler might find themselves stripped of promised spoils, denied access to the very women they were told would be their reward. In some cases, Women were publicly reassigned, paraded from one soldier to another as if to say your loyalty dictates your access. The woman was the currency, her body the coin. Imagine the silence in a household after this. A wife who once commanded respect now sits hollow-eyed by the fire, children avoiding her gaze, a husband unable to look at her without seeing his own failure reflected back. These weren't just assaults on bodies. They were detonations of entire social fabrics, and yet, through it all, women endured. Some survived by submission, by blending into the shadows, their voices barely whispers. Others turned the very weaponization of their bodies into a kind of survival strategy. Chronicles tell of women who, taken as captives, rose to wield influence in the courts of their conquerors. They learned languages, brokered favors, whispered counsel into the ears of kings. Their suffering was real, undeniable, but so was their resilience. The body may have been seized, but the mind remained sharp, waiting, biding, sometimes even bending the conqueror's will. There's a story of Roxolana, captured from her homeland and brought into the Ottoman court. She began as a concubine, a foreign girl among hundreds. But through wit, charm, and ruthless survival instincts, she became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent, one of the most powerful rulers of the era. From a weaponized body to the center of empire, her story is both a testament to cruelty and to survival. A paradox wrapped in silk. Still, for every Roxolana, there were thousands whose names vanished into silence, their bodies folded into conquest, their memories erased. They were the anonymous footnotes of empire, yet they bore the heaviest burdens. And as you walk through this invisible graveyard of lives, you realize conquest wasn't just about who held the throne. It was about who controlled the bodies of the most vulnerable, who turned them into instruments of legacy, humiliation, or deterrence. And if you think this chapter of history is finished, that humanity has grown beyond it, look around. In modern conflicts, reports still surface, women used as weapons, as warnings, as instruments of war. The medieval banquet may be gone, but the logic lingers like a bad smell through the centuries. The idea that the quickest way to break a people is to break its women has proven stubbornly immortal. You pull your cloak tighter, the night pressing in as if history itself were exhaling around you. The banquet hall is far behind, but the echoes of what kings did to the wives of their enemies follow you like shadows. You can almost hear the whispers of captives long gone, their stories struggling to surface, their pain seared into the marrow of history. And yet, there's another layer still. If you thought kings only weaponized women's bodies against their enemies, wait until you see how they turned those same bodies against each other, pitting queen against concubine, mother against daughter, wife against mistress. The battlefield wasn't always outside the walls. Sometimes, it was inside the very palace itself. The palace looks serene from outside, a silhouette of towers and banners against the twilight. But step inside, and serenity is the first illusion to die. The marble gleams, the air smells of incense, and silken slippers whisper across mosaic floors. Yet beneath the perfume and polished stone hums a current of venom, subtle as the flick of a jeweled dagger. Here, women are no longer just victims of conquest. They are pawns and predators, maneuvered against one another in a game where survival means outwitting not just kings, but each other. The harem, the concubine quarters, the queen's apartments, different names, same storm. To an outsider, they might look like a paradise of luxury, embroidered cushions, fountains bubbling with perfumed water, trays of fruit gleaming under golden lamps. But don't be fooled. It was less a sanctuary than a chessboard, and every woman on it was a piece to be moved, sacrificed, or crowned. Imagine stepping into that world as a new captive, torn from your homeland, shoved into this perfumed prison. You are handed silks, bathed, and taught how to bow. Yet every smile you receive is edged with calculation. The older women size you up like vultures circling a new carcass. Will you be a rival, a tool, or just another shadow to fade into obscurity? Kings engineered this rivalry deliberately. Divide and rule didn't just work on empires, it worked on women too. A king might pit a queen against a favored concubine, watching them vie for his attention like duelists armed with perfumes instead of swords. He might dangle favors, jewels, visits, whispers of affection, not out of love, but to ignite sparks of envy until the harem became its own battlefield. Why risk rebellion outside when the women inside would tear each other apart for scraps of affection. Take the Chinese imperial courts. Emperors were surrounded by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of concubines. Their ranks were strictly ordered, their fates rising or falling with the emperor's fickle gaze. A smile could elevate a woman to power. A yawn could condemn her to obscurity, and the women knew it. Alliances formed and dissolved in whispers. Food was poisoned, rivals accused of witchcraft, silken sheets dusted with ground glass. The emperor might never notice the war raging beneath his nose, but the women fought it every day, because to lose was to vanish. Or consider the Ottoman harem, where the sultan's concubines weren't just lovers, they were potential mothers of future heirs. The moment a child was born, the stakes sharpened. A concubine with a son could rise above a childless rival, but that also painted a target on her back. Whispers in the corridors tell of infants smothered in the night, of women mysteriously falling ill, of alliances collapsing like dominoes when a boy took his first steps. The harem wasn't just a place of silk and song. It was a cradle and a graveyard at once, and the queens? Their crowns were no protection. In fact, they often bore the heaviest burdens. A legitimate queen had to endure her husband's public parade of mistresses, had to swallow her humiliation with a frozen smile, all while plotting how to keep her children alive against the flood of bastards born to concubines. Some wielded power by turning rivals into allies. Others sharpened their tongues into weapons, their court gossip cutting deeper than any blade. Still others turned to poisons, the universal language of desperate women in gilded cages. Here's the cruelest irony: kings loved this chaos. They watched women fight over them, as though their affection was gold dust, never admitting that the chaos was carefully arranged, like pieces on a game board. The king wasn't just ruler of a kingdom, he was the puppet master of envy, and every squabble fed his ego. Now, before you pity these women as helpless dolls, remember they were anything but. Some mastered this brutal system. They played envy like a harp, sowed rumors with surgical precision, and smiled as their rivals vanished. Others cultivated the king's trust so deeply that even generals bowed to them. And sometimes, just sometimes, women banded together, turning the game on its head, whispering alliances so strong they bent the king himself. Power, even stolen and fragile, still left fingerprints. Walk deeper into these halls, and you'll feel the tension in the air, sharp as a drawn bowstring. Every glance is loaded, every smile a disguise. Women rehearse laughter in front of mirrors, practice tears before servants, perfecting their performance because survival depends not on truth, but on illusion. The palace isn't a home. It's a stage, and the price of forgetting your lines is death. And yet, amid the schemes and rivalries, there's humanity too. Women whispered lullabies to their children, shared stolen jokes in the baths, clutched talismans from their lost homes. Behind every plotted poison or whispered rumor was a heart that once beat freely. They were captives, yes, but they were also survivors, improvising their lives in cages of silk and suspicion. And so you stand here, in the flickering candlelight of a palace corridor, listening to the footsteps of rival concubines echo like distant drums. Somewhere beyond these walls, kingdoms rise and fall, armies march, cities burn. But inside, the war is quieter, deadlier, fought with smiles, whispers, and the calculated flutter of an eyelash. If you think this rivalry was dangerous, wait until you see what happened when kings extended their cruelty beyond the harem, using wives and daughters not only as pawns against each other, but as executioners of their own families, forcing women to become instruments of betrayal. The palace grows colder as you wander deeper into its bones. The laughter of concubines fades, the music of flutes is muffled by heavy doors, and in its place comes a silence that feels heavier than stone. Here, the king's cruelty takes on its sharpest edge. It is no longer enough to parade women as trophies, or to make them claw at each other for scraps of favor. No, true power, the kind that breaks spirits for generations, comes from forcing women to betray their own blood. Picture this: a queen summoned into a dim chamber. Her husband, the king, sits on a throne too tall for the room, shadows pooling around his face. At his feet kneels her brother, bound and beaten. The king does not raise his voice, he does not need to. He simply places a dagger in the queen's hand. The choice is simple. Prove loyalty to him by cutting her brother's throat, or watch her children die in front of her. The cruelty lies not just in the act, but in the trap. Whatever she chooses, her soul is already shattered. This was no theatrical fantasy. History is full of such moments. In the Byzantine court, emperors forced empresses to sign execution orders against their own relatives, the ink still wet on their trembling hands. In Mughal India, women of royal households sometimes stood powerless as their fathers or brothers were strangled with silk cords, the killers bowing afterward as if it were a routine duty. In Qing China, a concubine might be ordered to denounce her own son if his claim to succession threatened the emperor's chosen heir. To refuse was treason. To agree was mutilation of the soul. Kings understood something brutal about human psychology. It was not enough to defeat an enemy. You had to corrupt the very fabric of their love. A battle lost could be avenged. A betrayal committed with your own hands, against your child, your sister, your mother, that wound was eternal. No rebellion could be born from ashes so poisoned. And let's be honest, has that logic really disappeared? In today's world, betrayal is often demanded in quieter ways. Workers asked to fire their own colleagues, families divided by politics, friends turning on each other online for approval. We don't hand out daggers anymore, but the principle is the same. Loyalty proven by sacrifice of those closest to you. Kings may be gone, but the stage is still set. Back in the palace, the cruelty continued long after the act itself. Women who carried out such betrayals became prisoners of their own survival. Some were celebrated as loyal wives, strong enough to put duty above blood. Others were cast aside the moment their usefulness ended, haunted by the memory of their hands, their signatures, their silence. Imagine the hush of their chambers afterward, a queen sitting alone, jewels heavy on her wrists, staring at her hands as though they belonged to a stranger. And yet, some resisted. Chronicles whisper of women who refused, who flung the dagger down or spat in the face of their king. Most of them died, yes, but their defiance sometimes ignited embers among others. Their refusal became a story, and stories, inconveniently, have a way of outlasting kings. You pause at the end of the corridor. A draft snakes through the stone, carrying the faint sound of weeping. Perhaps it is memory, perhaps it is imagination. But you cannot shake the truth of it. The cruelest throne is not built on bloodshed alone, but on the twisting of love into a weapon. And if you thought forcing women to betray their kin was the end of cruelty, wait until you see how kings handled the ultimate terror. Not just living wives or daughters, but their corpses. Dead women turned into symbols, warnings, and grotesque trophies that still haunted the living. The air in the palace graveyard is heavy, damp with incense and secrets. You might think that once death came, the cruelty ended, that the suffering of queens, concubines, and captives dissolved into silence. But kings were not so merciful. For them, even a woman's corpse could still serve a purpose. Even in death, she was property, a message, a warning carved into marble and memory. Picture the wife of a defeated enemy. She takes her last breath not by choice, but by decree. Sometimes strangled with silk cords, merciful methods to avoid spilling royal blood. Sometimes drowned in a bath, her last sigh swallowed by rose water. Her body was not buried with honor, but displayed. Hung at city gates, flung into rivers, or paraded before crowds. Death was never private. It was theater. The corpse said what words could not. This is what happens when you defy me. The Mongols nailed women to city walls as living warnings. And when they died, their bodies remained where they hung, swaying in the wind, terrifying the next city into surrender, before a single arrow was fired. The Romans left wives of rebels unburied on the roadside, the ultimate dishonor in a culture where burial was sacred. The Ottomans quietly drowned concubines in the Bosporus, their veiled bodies floating to the surface like terrible flowers. So many, in fact, that whispers in Istanbul claimed the tide itself carried gossip from the palace. And here's the strangest, most chilling irony. Sometimes death elevated these women into legends. Queens who suffered grotesque ends became martyrs in the eyes of their people. The violated became saints, the silenced became voices. Think of Cleopatra hounded by Rome. Her suicide turned into a symbol of defiance that outlived every emperor who mocked her. Or Anne Boleyn, whose beheading was staged as a spectacle, her head rolled, but her story still whispers through England's stone corridors centuries later. Kings tried to weaponize corpses, but the dead have a way of slipping beyond control. A body tossed into a ditch could be forgotten, but a body mourned, remembered, sung about in taverns and whispered about in lullabies. That became a rebellion of its own. Death silenced the woman, yes, but the symbol she became often slipped from the king's grasp. Still, for those left alive, the fear was suffocating. Imagine being a concubine watching your rival's body dragged through the courtyard. Imagine being a queen forced to walk past the coffin of a sister executed for treason. Imagine lying awake at night, wondering if tomorrow it would be your turn. Your beauty, your loyalty, your body, first weaponized in life, then recycled in death. And yet, you stand here at the edge of the graveyard, hearing the echo of history, and realize something else. Cruelty may shape memory, but it cannot own it. These women's lives, stolen, twisted, humiliated, still whisper to us. They remind us that behind every marble statue and royal chronicle lies a darker story, one that kings tried to hide but which stubbornly survives. So as the incense curls upward and the torches gutter in the night, you feel the last lesson pressed down, like the weight of the centuries. Kings could control bodies, bend wills, even desecrate corpses, but they could never quite erase the humanity that lingered, the small sparks of defiance, the memory of women who endured, resisted, or simply refused to be forgotten. And if you think history ends here, you're wrong. For cruelty never really dies. It just finds new stages, new costumes, new kings. The question is not whether it still exists. The question is, when you see it next, will you recognize it?